You can tell a lot about a person by the way they treat someone who can do nothing for them. Rain slid slowly down the diner windows on West 43rd Street, turning the neon open sign into a blurry red glow that flickered across the empty booths. It was nearly midnight, and Manhattan had finally grown quiet. The businessmen were gone. The tourists had disappeared into yellow cabs and warm hotel lobbies. Only the tired people remained now, the lonely ones. Clara Bennett wiped down the counter for the third time, even though it was already clean. Her white sneakers squeaked softly against the black and white tile floor as the old coffee machine hissed behind her like it was struggling to stay awake too. "You should head home, kid," old Mrs. Romano called from the kitchen. "Storm's getting worse." Clara glanced through the fog glass toward the street outside. Rain hammered the pavement hard enough to blur the headlights crawling through traffic. "Can't," she said quietly. "Need the extra hours." Mrs. Romano sighed but didn't argue. Everyone at Rosie's diner knew Clara needed the money. The overdue rent notices. The hospital bills folded carefully inside her locker. The fact that she sometimes skipped dinner but always brought leftovers home for her mother first. Clara reached for another stack of coffee mugs when the bell above the diner door suddenly rang. Cold wind swept inside with the smell of rain and expensive cologne. A man stepped through the doorway wearing a charcoal overcoat darkened by water. Tall, broad shoulders, late 30s maybe. The kind of man who looked out of place in a $12 diner meal special. His black leather shoes reflected the fluorescent lights as he paused near the entrance, scanning the nearly empty restaurant with tired gray eyes. Not arrogant eyes. Exhausted ones. Clara grabbed a menu automatically and walked toward him. "Table for one?" she asked softly. The man gave a slight nod. His jaw looked tense, like he'd spent the entire day clenching it. "Booth by the window, okay?" "That's fine." His voice was calm, deep, controlled in the way wealthy men often sounded when they were used to being listened to. Clara led him toward the corner booth. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere above the city skyline. As she reached for the coffee pot beside the counter, another server rushed past too quickly. Her shoulder slammed into Clara's arm. The fresh coffee slipped from Clara's hands before she could react. Hot liquid splashed across the stranger's expensive coat. The entire diner froze. "Oh my God." Clara stepped back immediately, pale with horror. "I'm so sorry." Coffee dripped slowly from the sleeve of the coat onto the polished floor. The other waitress muttered a nervous apology and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Clara standing there alone with the damage. For one terrible second, Clara could only stare at the dark stains spreading across fabric that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent. "Sir, I can pay for the cleaning," she said quickly, even though both of them probably knew she couldn't. "It was an accident." The man looked down at the ruined coat silently. Then his eyes lifted toward her trembling hands. Strange eyes, Clara noticed suddenly. Sharp but distant. Like someone carrying too much weight for too long. "Why are your hands shaking more than mine?" he asked quietly. Clara blinked. The question caught her off guard. Most rich customers yelled first and listened later. This one didn't even sound angry. Just curious. "Because people like you don't usually come into places like this," she admitted carefully. One corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. "People like me?" Clara swallowed. "People wearing watches that cost more than my apartment." His gaze dropped briefly toward the silver watch beneath his sleeve before returning to her face. For the first time that night, something shifted in his expression. Not amusement. Recognition. Like he wasn't used to someone speaking honestly to him. Outside, rain crashed harder against the windows. Inside, the diner suddenly felt smaller. Quieter. Clara grabbed a towel quickly and reached toward the table. "Please let me fix this." But before she could wipe the coffee away, the man noticed something sitting near the register counter behind her. An old paperback book with highlighted pages and sticky notes. Sticking out from the edges. Principles of Global Market Structures. His eyes narrowed slightly. Then he looked back at Clara again, this time differently. Not like a waitress. Not like background noise. Like a question he suddenly wanted answered. Clara followed his gaze toward the worn paperback near the register and immediately reached for it, almost too quickly. "It is nothing," she said softly, tucking the book beneath a stack of napkins. But the man had already seen the pages filled with handwritten notes. Colored tabs. Equations in the margins. Not the kind of thing most waitresses carried during a midnight shift in Hell's Kitchen. He leaned back slowly in the booth while rainwater still glistened along the shoulders of his coat. Global market structures are not exactly light reading after midnight. Clara forced a small smile as she wiped the coffee from the table. Some people watch television to relax. And you study international finance? Used textbooks are cheaper than therapy. That earned the faintest reaction from him. Barely visible, but real. Clara noticed because she had spent years studying people who tried too hard to hide what they felt. Rich customers. Doctors leaving the hospital across the street. Men sitting alone at 2 in the morning pretending they were not lonely. She handed him a clean menu. Coffee is free tonight. Least I can do after ruining your coat. You did not ruin it. That coat probably costs $4,000. Closer to 6. Clara closed her eyes briefly. That somehow makes me feel worse. This time he almost smiled again. Almost. The diner fell quiet except for the soft clinking of dishes from the kitchen and the storm outside. Neon light painted pale streaks across the booth between them. What is good here? He finally asked. Clara shrugged lightly. Depends how honest you want me to be. Honest. The apple pie. That is all. Everything else tastes better before 10 o'clock. He nodded once. Then pie and black coffee. Clara wrote it down neatly on her order pad. Her handwriting looked careful, precise. The kind teachers used to praise before life interrupted everything. As she turned toward the kitchen, his voice stopped her again. You read economic theory for fun, yet you work double shifts in a diner. Clara looked over her shoulder. That sounded less rude in your head, did it not? For the first time, he actually smiled. Small, tired, human. Probably. She studied him for a moment longer. Most wealthy men filled silence by talking about themselves. Their companies, their cars, their vacation homes in Aspen or the Hamptons. This man did not. He wore wealth quietly, like armor he no longer enjoyed carrying. You ask a lot of questions for someone who came here to be alone, Clara said. Something flickered behind his gray eyes, then disappeared just as quickly. Maybe I changed my mind. Clara disappeared into the kitchen before he could say anything else. Mrs. Romano immediately leaned closer. Who is Mr. Wall Street out there? Clara grabbed a coffee mug. No idea. Honey, men with shoes like that do not eat pie in diners during thunderstorms. Clara poured fresh coffee carefully. Maybe he got lost. Mrs. Romano snorted softly. Men like him are never lost. They just pretend they are. A few minutes later, Clara returned carrying the pie and coffee. The stranger had loosened his tie slightly now. His expensive watch rested beside his phone on the table, both forgotten for the first time all evening. Clara set the plate down gently. Careful. Pie plate is hot. Thank you. As she reached to refill his water glass, his phone lit up suddenly against the dark booth. Multiple missed calls flashed across the screen beside a news notification. Caldwell Capital announces emergency board meeting. Clara froze for half a second before looking away. Ethan noticed. Most people reacted instantly when they recognized the Caldwell name. Investors, journalists, strangers trying to impress him. Clara simply stepped back quietly like she had seen nothing at all. You know who I am, he said calmly. She folded the towel in her hands once before answering. I know your face is on the business magazines near the register. And I still need to close out table 7 before Mrs. Romano yells at me. Ethan stared at her as if he had forgotten how normal conversations worked. That is it. Clara tilted her head slightly. Should there be more? Outside, lightning flashed across the rain-soaked street. For a brief second, the diner windows glowed silver. Ethan Caldwell had spent 15 years surrounded by people desperate for his attention. Investors chased him. Reporters followed him. Entire rooms changed behavior when he walked inside them. But this exhausted girl in a faded diner uniform only looked at him the same way she looked at everyone else. Calmly, honestly, without calculation. And somehow, that unsettled him more than anything had in months. Clara reached for the empty coffee pot beside the booth. You should head home before the storm gets worse, Mr. Caldwell. Ethan looked out at the rain for a long moment. Then back at her. What if I do not really have one tonight? Clara did not answer immediately. She only noticed the exhaustion in his face again, the kind no expensive suit could hide. And somewhere beneath the sound of thunder and rattling windows, something inside her softened. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rain continued sliding down the diner windows in silver streams, while somewhere outside a siren echoed through the wet Manhattan streets. Clara stood beside the booth holding the empty coffee pot against her chest, studying Ethan Caldwell more carefully now. Not the billionaire from magazine covers. Not the polished executive standing beside stock market headlines. Just a tired man sitting alone in a nearly empty diner after midnight, staring at a storm like he had nowhere else to go. Everyone has somewhere, Clara finally said softly. Ethan looked down at the untouched slice of apple pie in front of him. Not always somewhere they want to be. His voice carried no self-pity. That was what surprised her most. Wealthy people usually spoke about problems like inconveniences, delayed flights, bad investments, expensive divorces hidden behind public relations statements. But whatever sat behind Ethan's eyes looked heavier than that. Clara glanced toward the clock above the kitchen. 12:37. Her shift officially ended 20 minutes ago, but she still had side work to finish before catching the downtown train. Kitchen closes in 10 minutes, she said quietly. You should probably order something else before Mrs. Romano starts unplugging appliances. Ethan leaned back slightly. Are you always this subtle when telling customers to leave? Only the ones sitting alone during thunderstorms looking like they forgot how to sleep. He let out a quiet breath through his nose. Almost a laugh. Almost. Clara turned away before the silence between them could become uncomfortable and carried the coffee pot back behind the counter. Mrs. Romano lowered her glasses and watched her carefully. You are talking to him like he is normal. Clara grabbed a clean towel. Maybe he wants someone to. Honey, billionaires do not want normal. They want control. Clara glanced back toward Ethan. He was staring absently at the rain now, one hand resting near his phone without touching it. For the first time all evening, the sharpness in his face looked softer somehow. Older. I do not think that man even remembers what normal feels like, Clara murmured. Mrs. Romano followed her gaze and sighed quietly. That is because rich men spend their whole lives building tall buildings around themselves. Eventually, they cannot find the door anymore. Clara smiled faintly at that. A few minutes later, she approached Ethan's booth again, carrying a fresh cup of coffee she had not charged him for. On the house, she said. Ethan looked at the mug. You are aware your business strategy needs work. Rosie's Diner has survived 42 years without hedge funds. Impressive. We also survived a rat problem in 1998. Very diversified portfolio. This time, Ethan laughed softly for real. The sound surprised both of them. Clara noticed how quickly it disappeared again, like laughter was something unfamiliar now. Ethan stirred the coffee slowly, though he drank it black. You really do not care who I am, do you? Clara leaned lightly against the edge of the booth. I think people care too much about titles. Easy thing to say when you do not run a company with 20,000 employees. Easy thing to forget when everyone only sees your money. Ethan's fingers stopped moving against the coffee spoon. Clara immediately realized she had gone too far. Sorry, she said quietly. I should not have said that. No, his gray eyes lifted toward hers again. Calm. Focused. You probably should have. The storm outside deepened. Wind rattled the old diner windows hard enough to make the hanging lights sway slightly overhead. Somewhere near the entrance, cold air slipped beneath the doorframe. Clara rubbed her arms unconsciously. Ethan noticed immediately. Do they not fix the heat in here? Clara smiled tiredly. Mrs. Romano says the heater has character. Meaning it only works when it feels emotionally supported. Another small silence settled between them. Comfortable this time. Strange how quickly strangers could stop feeling like strangers in the middle of the night. Ethan glanced toward the old finance book near the register again. How long have you been studying markets? Clara hesitated. A while. That is not an answer. It was not meant to be. Ethan watched her carefully now. Most people became nervous under his attention. Clara simply held his gaze with quiet steadiness, though exhaustion lingered beneath her eyes. He noticed details other people probably missed. The faint ink marks on her fingers from taking notes. The way she mentally calculated every customer bill before touching the register. The intelligence hidden beneath routine movements. You were in college, Ethan said finally. Not a question. Clara looked away first. A long time ago. Economics. Something like that. And now you work midnight shifts in a diner. Her expression remained calm, but something in her shoulders tightened almost invisibly. Life happens fast when hospitals are involved. Ethan went quiet immediately after that. Clara regretted the words the second they slipped out. She did not talk about her mother with strangers. Ever. But there was something dangerous about late nights and soft rain against windows. It made honesty easier than it should be. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the coffee cup again. My father spent 8 months in a hospital before he died. Clara blinked softly, surprised. Ethan rarely talked about his family publicly. Most interviews described him as cold, untouchable, self-made after inheriting a struggling investment firm at 26. But no article ever mentioned sadness in his voice. I am sorry, Clara said gently. Ethan nodded once. Everyone said money would make things easier after that. He stared at the steam rising from the coffee. It just made everything quieter. Clara looked at him differently then. Not as Ethan Caldwell the billionaire. Just Ethan, a man carrying silence like a second shadow. And somewhere beneath the glow of flickering diner lights, Clara realized something unexpected. For the first time in years, someone was speaking to her like she existed beyond her uniform. And for the first time in even longer, Ethan Caldwell was listening when someone spoke back. The storm finally began to weaken around 1:30 in the morning. Rain still tapped softly against the diner windows, but the violent wind had faded into something quieter now, almost tired. Clara stood behind the register counting receipts, while Mrs. Romano stacked chairs upside down on empty tables. The old jukebox near the corner hummed faintly to itself, stuck between stations again. Ethan remained in the booth by the window, untouched coffee cooling slowly beside him. Most customers rushed home the second weather improved. He did not move. Clara noticed that without trying to notice. You keep staring at him, Mrs. Romano muttered quietly while drying plates. Clara frowned slightly. I do not. Honey, I raised 4 sons. I know what observing looks like. Clara rolled her eyes lightly, but her attention drifted back toward Ethan anyway. He was looking down at his phone now, reading something with the same expression people wore while opening hospital test results. Focused, guarded, alone. A moment later the phone buzzed again. Ethan closed his eyes briefly before answering. What? His voice turned colder immediately, sharper. Clara could not hear the person on the other side, but she watched the change happen anyway. The invisible wall sliding back into place around him. I said no. Silence. Because I am tired of cleaning up mistakes made by men who confuse greed with intelligence. Another pause. Ethan's jaw tightened. Move the board meeting to Friday. His tone lowered, dangerously calm. And if Daniel does not like it, he can resign. Clara looked away politely the second his eyes lifted from the phone. She pretended to organize sugar packets instead. A few seconds later, Ethan ended the call and sat perfectly still. Not angry, just exhausted in a deeper way now. Mrs. Romano disappeared into the kitchen carrying dishes, leaving Clara alone in the quiet diner with him. You know, Clara said carefully while wiping the counter. Normal people usually sleep at 1 in the morning. Ethan glanced toward her. Normal people are smarter than I am. That explains Wall Street. A faint smile touched his face before disappearing again. Clara walked toward his booth carrying the check. I should probably close out your ticket before Mrs. Romano starts charging overnight rent. Ethan accepted the receipt but barely looked at it. Can I ask you something? Clara hesitated for half a second. Depends. Why economics? She blinked softly at the question. Not because of what he asked. Because of how gently he asked it. Most people heard she liked finance and immediately turned it into a joke or an interrogation. Ethan sounded genuinely curious. Clara slid into the booth across from him without fully meaning to. Outside, water dripped rhythmically from the diner awning onto the sidewalk. My father loved numbers, she said quietly. He fixed elevators in Brooklyn. Never went to college. But every night he used to watch financial news while eating microwave dinners and pretend he understood stock markets. Ethan listened silently. When I was 13, he bought me this old economics book from a library sale for $2. A small smile touched Clara's lips at the memory. I thought it was incredibly boring. And now I read market reports during lunch breaks in diners. Ethan studied her face carefully. You miss it. Clara looked down at her hands immediately. Some things are expensive even before money gets involved. Ethan understood that answer more than she realized. Silence settled between them. Again, soft and heavy. The kind silence that no longer felt awkward. Clara noticed Ethan's expensive coat still hanging damp beside the booth. She reached over instinctively and touched the sleeve lightly. You should not wear this outside yet. It is still soaked. Ethan looked at her hand against the fabric, then at her. You worry about strangers often? Clara pulled her hand back quickly. Occupational hazard. You do realize most people in this city would recognize me and ask for something by now. Clara tilted her head slightly. Maybe that says more about your city than about me. Ethan leaned back slowly, watching her with quiet fascination now. You really are different. Clara gave a tired laugh under her breath. No, I am just too exhausted to pretend. Somewhere in the kitchen, a glass clinked softly. Mrs. Romano was humming Frank Sinatra to herself while closing up. Ethan glanced around the small diner again. The cracked leather booths, the flickering neon lights, the handwritten pie menu taped beside the register. You know, he said quietly, this place feels more honest than most boardrooms I have sat in. That is because nobody here has enough energy to lie professionally. Another real laugh escaped him then, low and genuine this time. Clara stared slightly, surprised by how much younger he looked when he forgot to be guarded. Ethan noticed her expression immediately. What? Clara shook her head lightly. Nothing. That was definitely something. She hesitated before answering honestly. You do not look like the version of you people talk about on television. Ethan's smile faded slowly. Television only likes the useful parts of people. Clara felt something ache quietly in her chest at that sentence. Because she understood it too well. The waitress. The caretaker. The daughter trying to survive another month. People rarely looked beyond what they needed from you. Ethan reached into his wallet, then paused. Instead of cash or a black card, he pulled out a simple white business card and placed it carefully beside her finance book near the register. Caldwell Capital. His private number written neatly across the back in black ink. Clara looked at it cautiously. What is this? Ethan stood slowly, slipping into his damp coat again. In case you ever get tired of wasting your intelligence on people who only order pie. Clara stared at the card while thunder rumbled faintly somewhere far above Manhattan. And if I never call? Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. Then at least I will know someone honest still exists in this city. Then without another word, Ethan Caldwell walked toward the diner door and disappeared into the rainy New York night, leaving Clara alone beneath the flickering neon lights with his card resting quietly in her trembling hands. Clara did not sleep that night. The business card remained on the tiny kitchen table beside her untouched cup of instant coffee while rainwater tapped softly against the apartment window. Her apartment sat on the 4th floor of an aging brick building in Queens where the pipes groaned every winter and the elevator worked only when it felt generous. The place smelled faintly like old radiator heat and laundry detergent no matter how many candles she lit. Across the room, her mother slept quietly beneath a faded blue blanket on the pull-out couch, an oxygen machine humming softly beside her like a tired heartbeat. Clara stood near the sink staring at Ethan's handwriting on the back of the card. Simple black ink. No assistant number. No office extension. Just his direct line. She should have thrown it away hours ago. Men like Ethan Caldwell existed in another universe. One with private drivers and glass towers and meetings that moved millions of dollars before breakfast. Clara existed in subway stations and late rent notices and pharmacy receipts folded carefully inside her jacket pocket. Their worlds were not supposed to touch twice. Yet somehow his voice still lingered in her mind. Then at least I will know someone honest still exists in this city. Clara exhaled slowly and tucked the card into her finance book before forcing herself toward the shower. By 6:30 the next morning, she was back on the downtown train, surrounded by exhausted strangers clutching paper coffee cups and staring blankly at phones. Manhattan blurred past the train windows in streaks of gray and silver. Clara leaned her head lightly against the cold glass while reviewing financial notes she had copied by hand into a spiral notebook. Currency markets, Asian trade indexes, inflation projections. Most people on the train probably assumed she was cramming for college classes. None of them knew she had dropped out 2 years earlier after her mother's second surgery drained everything they had left. You still studying rich people money? A familiar voice asked suddenly. Clara looked up to find Marcus, the diner cook, sitting across from her with a grocery bag balanced on his knee. Good morning to you too, Clara muttered. Marcus grinned. You know most waitresses spend subway rides sleeping. Most waitresses are smarter than me. No, Marcus said calmly. Most people just quit earlier. Clara looked away after that because somehow the sentence hurt more than encouragement should. By 7:15 Rosie's diner was alive again. Coffee machines hissed. Plates clattered. Taxi drivers crowded the booths near the front windows while construction workers ordered pancakes before early shifts. Clara tied her apron behind her waist and forced herself into motion. Work helped. Work always helped. It kept thoughts from becoming dangerous. Around 9 o'clock, the front door opened again. Clara barely looked up at first. Then her hands froze around the coffee pot. Ethan Caldwell stood near the entrance wearing a dark wool coat and charcoal scarf, rain still clinging lightly to his shoulders from outside. But this time he was not alone. Two men in expensive suits stood behind him, speaking quietly into wireless earpieces while scanning the diner automatically. The entire room shifted the second they walked in. Customers whispered. Phones lifted subtly. One of the younger waitresses nearly dropped a tray. Clara stared at Ethan in disbelief. He noticed her instantly. "Good morning," he said simply, like arriving at her diner during rush hour with security teams behind him was completely normal. Clara blinked twice. "You came back. You sound surprised. Billionaires usually have better breakfast options." Ethan glanced toward the laminated menu taped beside the register. "I was promised honest pancakes." Marcus nearly choked laughing from behind the grill. Clara shook her head slowly and grabbed menus anyway. "Booth or table?" "Booth." As Ethan followed her through the crowded diner, conversations lowered around him in waves. Clara noticed people staring openly now. Not at him. At her. Like they were trying to solve a puzzle they did not understand. Ethan slid into the same booth from the night before while his security team remained near the entrance pretending not to watch everything. Clara placed coffee in front of him automatically. You know, bringing bodyguards into Rosie's diner feels slightly dramatic. One of them once tackled a man for getting too close during an airport interview. Comforting. Ethan looked around the diner quietly. Morning sunlight pushed weakly through the cloudy windows now, catching dust in the air like floating gold. Somehow the place looked softer in daylight. Less lonely. "You work every day?" he asked. 6 days. "And the 7th? Clara grabbed her order pad. "Hospital visits. Laundry. Trying not to cry in grocery stores." Ethan's expression shifted immediately. Clara regretted the honesty the second it escaped her mouth. But exhaustion always loosened her guard around him somehow. Ethan studied her for a moment before speaking carefully. "You joke about difficult things." Clara scribbled fake notes onto the pad. "It is cheaper than therapy." Ethan leaned back slowly, still watching her. "You know, most people become nervous around me. Most people are trying to get something from you. And you are not." Clara met his eyes calmly then. "No." The answer landed quietly between them. "Honest. Uncomplicated." Ethan lowered his gaze for a second, as if something about that affected him more than expected. Then his phone buzzed sharply across the table. One glance at the screen changed his expression immediately. Cold again. Focused. Wall Street returned to his face like armor sliding back into place. Clara stepped away instinctively. But before she could leave fully, Ethan looked up at her once more. "Do not disappear today," he said quietly. "I have something I want to ask you." And for reasons Clara could not explain, her heartbeat suddenly forgot its rhythm. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of coffee refills and clattering dishes, but Clara could feel Ethan's presence in the diner even when she was not looking at him. It was strange. Some people entered a room loudly. Ethan Caldwell did it silently. Yet somehow every conversation still shifted around him. Every customer noticed him without meaning to. Around 11:30, the breakfast rush finally slowed. Sunlight pushed weakly through the clouds outside, turning the wet Manhattan sidewalk silver. Clara carried a fresh pot of coffee toward Ethan's booth, while his security team quietly stepped outside to take phone calls near the curb. Ethan sat alone now with his suit jacket folded neatly beside him and a tablet open across the table. Numbers filled the screen in complicated columns of market projections and investment charts. Clara recognized the software instantly. She stopped herself from reacting. Barely. Ethan noticed anyway. "You know what this is," he said calmly without looking up. Clara poured coffee into his cup carefully. "A spreadsheet." One eyebrow lifted slightly. "That is your answer? You are fishing for compliments." Ethan leaned back slowly. "And if I am?" Clara shrugged. "Then I charge consulting fees." A quiet smile touched his mouth before fading again. Ethan rotated the tablet slightly toward her. "Humor me." Clara glanced at the screen despite herself. Asian manufacturing indexes. Currency fluctuations. International shipping projections. She immediately spotted the problem buried inside the quarterly forecasts. Her eyes narrowed faintly. Ethan watched every change in her expression. Whoever prepared this report, Clara said carefully, is either lazy or lying. Ethan's fingers stilled against the coffee cup. Interesting distinction. Clara pointed lightly toward one section without touching the screen. Your Southeast Asia growth projections do not match your shipping costs. Explain. Freight prices increased nearly 12% last quarter. If these numbers were real, your margins would be collapsing, not improving. Ethan stared at her quietly now. Completely still. Clara immediately stepped back. Sorry. You said humor you. No, his voice remained calm, but sharper somehow. Focused. Keep going. Clara hesitated. Every instinct told her to stop. People like Ethan did not casually ask waitresses to analyze billion-dollar reports. But another part of her, the part she buried beneath exhaustion and double shifts, had already awakened. The numbers are polished too perfectly, she said softly. Real markets do not move this smoothly unless someone is adjusting the volatility. Ethan's gray eyes locked onto hers completely now. And what does that suggest to you? Clara glanced toward the diner windows before answering quietly. Someone inside your company wants investors to see stability that does not actually exist. Silence. Even the diner itself seemed quieter somehow. Ethan slowly closed the tablet screen. Do you know how many analysts I pay 7 figures a year? Clara gave a tired smile. Probably too many if they missed that. To her surprise, Ethan laughed softly again. But there was no amusement in his eyes now. Only something heavier. Thoughtful. You saw all that in less than 30 seconds. Clara looked down at the coffee pot in her hands. Old habits. Harvard. Clara blinked in surprise. What? You think like someone trained professionally. She shook her head immediately. No, Yale. Definitely no. Ethan studied her carefully. Then where? Clara looked away first. Outside, steam rose from subway grates into the cold afternoon air while taxis splashed rainwater along the street. Brooklyn Public Library, she said quietly. And a lot of free online lectures at 2 in the morning. Ethan stared at her like he was trying to solve something impossible. That is not normal. Clara laughed under her breath. Neither is discussing international shipping volatility in a diner. Before Ethan could answer, the front door suddenly opened hard enough for the bell overhead to rattle sharply. A woman in an expensive cream coat stepped inside wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. Tall, elegant, perfectly composed in the exhausting way wealthy people often were. Her eyes landed on Ethan instantly. There you are. Ethan's entire expression changed the second he saw her. Not warmth. Not happiness. Tension. Clara recognized it immediately. The woman approached the booth gracefully while removing her gloves. Your assistant said you disappeared after the board call. Then her eyes shifted toward Clara standing beside the table. A brief silence followed. Measured. Cold. I did not realize you were busy. Clara stepped back automatically. I can give you a minute. No. Ethan said immediately, surprising both women. Stay. The woman's perfectly shaped eyebrows lifted slightly. Interesting. Ethan stood slowly. Victoria, this is Clara. Victoria looked Clara over from head to toe. Not cruelly. Worse. Politely. The waitress. Clara felt heat rise beneath her skin, but kept her expression calm. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Clara noticed discrepancies in the Southeast Asia projections. Victoria's attention snapped back toward him instantly. Excuse me. Ethan picked up the tablet again and turned it toward her. She spotted the manipulated freight numbers in under a minute. For the first time since entering the diner, Victoria lost control of her expression. Only briefly, but Clara saw it. Shock. Real shock. Victoria looked back at Clara more carefully now. Not as a waitress. As a problem she had not anticipated. That is impressive, she said slowly. Clara folded her arms lightly. We're concerning for your analysts. Ethan pressed his knuckles briefly against his mouth, like he was hiding another smile. Victoria noticed that too. And somehow, the air inside the diner changed completely after that. For several seconds nobody spoke. The diner noise seemed distant suddenly, blurred beneath the tension settling quietly around the booth. Victoria removed her gloves with slow, careful movements while continuing to study Clara in a way that felt less insulting now and more analytical. Ethan remained standing beside the table, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the booth, his expression unreadable again. Clara recognized that look now. It was the version of him the business world knew. Controlled. Untouchable. You discussed internal projections with a waitress? Victoria finally asked, her tone calm enough to sound dangerous. Ethan did not look away from Clara. I discussed them with someone intelligent enough to notice the problem. Victoria crossed her arms lightly. And somehow none of your senior analysts managed that. Apparently not. Clara shifted awkwardly beside the booth. I should probably get back to work. No. Ethan said again, too quickly. Victoria noticed immediately. So did Clara. Ethan exhaled once before lowering his voice slightly. Please stay. Something in the word please softened the moment unexpectedly. Clara hesitated before slowly setting the coffee pot back onto the counter beside the booth. Victoria sat down across from Ethan then, elegant and composed even beneath fluorescent diner lighting. Daniel has been adjusting regional forecasts for months, she said quietly. We suspected inconsistencies but could not isolate them. Clara frowned faintly. Because you were looking at percentages instead of movement patterns. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. Movement patterns? Clara glanced toward the tablet again, despite herself. Fake numbers usually focus on outcomes. Real markets behave emotionally, unevenly. Human behavior leaves fingerprints everywhere. Ethan stared at her carefully. You learned that from online lectures? Clara gave a small shrug. And from watching people. Victoria leaned back slowly now. Her expensive bracelet caught the diner light in sharp silver flashes. You are wasted here. Clara laughed softly under her breath. That seems to be the popular opinion today. Before anyone could answer, a loud voice suddenly rose from near the front counter. Miss Bennett. Clara turned immediately. Mr. Holloway, the owner of her apartment building, stood near the entrance holding a folded envelope in one hand and dripping rainwater onto the tile floor. Clara's stomach tightened instantly. You are 3 weeks late again, he announced loudly enough for half the diner to hear. Several customers glanced over uncomfortably. Clara walked toward him quickly. I said I would have it Friday. You said. That last Friday. Her face flushed with embarrassment. Please lower your voice. But Mr. Holloway only shoved the envelope toward her chest impatiently. I cannot keep doing this, Clara. I have bills too. Ethan watched the entire exchange silently from the booth. Victoria noticed his expression changing again. Not anger. Something colder. Clara accepted the envelope with trembling fingers. Final notice stamped across the front in red ink. I just need a little more time, she whispered. Mr. Holloway glanced around the diner before lowering his voice slightly. You are a good girl, Clara. But kindness does not pay mortgages. Then with a tired sigh, he turned and walked back into the rain-soaked street. Silence lingered after he left. Clara remained near the counter staring at the envelope in her hands while humiliation burned quietly beneath her skin. She hated this part most. Not being poor. Being seen struggling. Ethan stood slowly from the booth. How much? Clara looked up sharply. No, I did not ask if you wanted help. And I did not ask for it. Victoria watched both of them carefully now without interrupting. Clara folded the envelope tightly against her apron. I am not some tragic charity project, Mr. Caldwell. Ethan stopped a few feet away from her. I know that. Do you? Clara's voice stayed calm, but hurt slipped through anyway. Because rich people love fixing problems they do not actually understand. Ethan looked at her quietly for a long moment. Then he surprised her completely. When I was 26, he said softly, my father died and left me a collapsing company drowning in debt. Clara blinked. Ethan rarely spoke publicly about his past. Everyone assumed I succeeded because of money, he continued. What they do not mention is that I spent 2 years sleeping in my office and selling almost everything I owned trying to keep the company alive. Victoria lowered her eyes slightly. She had been there during those years. She remembered. Ethan's voice remained steady. Pride becomes very expensive when survival is involved. Clara stared at him silently now. The diner around them faded into soft background noise. Coffee machines. Quiet conversations. Rain against windows. Ethan stepped closer carefully. Not imposing. Just honest. I am not offering help because I pity you. His gray eyes held hers completely. I am offering because people should not have to drown alone. Clara looked down immediately after that, because something inside her chest hurt suddenly in a way she could not explain. For years she had carried everything herself. Hospital bills, rent, fear, exhaustion. She had forgotten what it sounded like when someone spoke gently to her instead of needing something from her. Victoria watched Clara carefully, then looked toward Ethan again. And for the first time since walking into Rosie's diner, she finally understood why the most guarded man in Manhattan kept returning to a small diner in Hell's Kitchen. The diner felt quieter after that conversation, though the lunch crowd had already begun filling the booths again. Forks clinked softly against plates. Taxi drivers laughed near the front window. Somewhere in the kitchen, Marcus argued with the coffee machine like it had personally betrayed him. But around Ethan and Clara, the world seemed to move more slowly now. Clara folded the eviction notice carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket without another word. Pride still burned inside her chest, stubborn and sharp. Yet Ethan's voice lingered there too. People should not have to drown alone. Victoria stood from the booth and adjusted the sleeve of her cream coat elegantly. The board meeting starts in 40 minutes, she reminded Ethan quietly. Ethan did not take his eyes off Clara. Delay it. Victoria blinked once. Again. Yes. Daniel is already furious. That makes two of us. Victoria hesitated before lowering her voice. Ethan, if the numbers really are manipulated, delaying too long could damage investor confidence. Ethan finally looked toward her. Calm. Cold. Certain. Then perhaps we should stop discussing million-dollar problems in diners and actually solve them. His gaze shifted back toward Clara after that. Come with us. Clara stared at him like he had spoken another language. Excuse me. The meeting? Absolutely not. Ethan leaned lightly against the booth. You already identified problems my analysts missed. In 30 seconds. Exactly. Clara shook her head immediately. I am a waitress. No, Ethan said quietly. That is just the uniform people decided to stop looking past. The words hit harder than she expected. Victoria watched the exchange silently now, her expression unreadable. Clara looked around the diner instinctively, as if someone else might step in and explain how ridiculous this situation had become. I cannot walk into some billionaire board meeting wearing an apron, then change out of the apron. That is not the point. Ethan stepped closer carefully. What are you actually afraid of? Clara opened her mouth and stopped. Because the answer embarrassed her more than poverty ever had. Being seen trying. Being laughed at. Being reminded that intelligence without money rarely counted in rooms like his. Ethan seemed to understand anyway. You think they will look down on you. Clara crossed her arms lightly. Would they not? Ethan glanced briefly toward Victoria. Victoria met Clara's eyes directly for the first time since entering the diner. Yes, she said honestly. Most of them will. Clara appreciated the honesty more than fake reassurance. But, Victoria continued calmly, they also underestimated Ethan 15 years ago because he inherited a dying company before 30. Ethan exhaled softly through his nose. You are becoming inspirational in your old age. Do not ruin the moment. Clara looked between them uncertainly. Something about their dynamic surprised her. Not romantic. Not performative. Just years of surviving pressure together. Why does this matter so much to you? Clara finally asked Ethan quietly. Ethan's expression shifted slightly then. Softer around the edges somehow. Because brilliance should not disappear just because life became difficult. Clara looked away immediately after that sentence. The diner lights blurred faintly for a second before she forced herself to breathe normally again. No one had spoken to her like that in years. Not since before hospitals and overdue bills and survival turned every dream practical. Marcus suddenly appeared beside the booth carrying a tray of fries. If rich people are recruiting my waitresses now, I expect compensation. Ethan looked at him seriously. What is your rate? Marcus blinked once before laughing loudly. Okay, I like him. Even Clara smiled despite herself. Ethan glanced toward the old clock above the register. The meeting starts in 30 minutes now. Clara stared at him. You are serious. Painfully. Outside the diner windows, black SUVs waited beside the curb while rainwater glistened across Manhattan streets like liquid glass. Clara imagined stepping inside one of those cars wearing her thrift store shoes and yesterday's exhaustion. It felt absurd. Impossible. I do not belong in your world, she whispered finally. Ethan looked at her quietly for a long moment before answering. Neither do half the men sitting in that boardroom. Silence followed. Then Victoria reached into her designer handbag and calmly placed a slim leather notebook onto the table beside Clara. If you are going to challenge executives who bill $800 an hour, she said, at least carry something more professional than diner receipts. Clara stared at the notebook in disbelief. Victoria's mouth curved faintly at the corners. Also, your analysis was correct. I checked the freight data while you were arguing with your own potential. Ethan almost smiled again at that. Clara looked down at the notebook slowly. Her reflection shimmered faintly across the polished black leather cover. Somewhere deep inside her chest, fear and hope collided painfully together. Ethan stepped toward the diner entrance, then paused beside her one last time. You once told me rich people like fixing problems they do not understand. Clara looked up at him carefully. Yes. Ethan nodded slightly toward the finance book near the register. Then come explain the problem to people who desperately need to hear it. And somehow, standing beneath flickering diner lights with rain falling softly beyond the windows, Clara realized her life had already started changing before she ever agreed to follow him. The elevator to Caldwell Capital rose so smoothly Clara barely felt it move. 38 floors above, Manhattan, rain clouds drifted between glass towers while the city stretched endlessly beneath them in silver and steel. Clara stood silently beside Ethan inside the private elevator, her hands folded tightly around Victoria's leather notebook. She had changed out of her diner apron in the employee restroom downstairs, replacing it with the only decent outfit she owned. A simple dark sweater, black slacks slightly faded at the knees, shoes polished carefully that morning with a paper towel and cooking oil because she could not afford real polish anymore. Beside her, Ethan adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit with calm precision while reviewing messages on his phone. He looked completely different here. Not softer like in the diner. Sharper somehow. Built for this world of glass walls and million-dollar decisions. Clara suddenly became painfully aware of every cheap stitch in her clothes. The elevator doors opened quietly into a private executive floor lined with marble and soft golden lighting. Conversation stopped almost instantly when Ethan stepped out. Employees straightened. Assistants lowered their voices. Men in expensive suits turned discreetly toward him. Then their eyes shifted toward Clara. Confusion followed immediately. Ethan kept walking. Ignore them, he said calmly. I am trying. No, you are shrinking. Clara looked at him sharply. Ethan did not slow his pace. Do not do that in there. Before Clara could answer, massive conference room doors opened ahead of them. Voices spilled outward. Sharp. Tense. Inside, nearly 20 executives sat around a polished black table overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Screens filled with market projections glowed against the walls. The room smelled faintly like espresso and expensive cologne. Daniel Mercer stood near the far end of the table mid-sentence when Ethan entered. Tall, silver-haired, perfectly tailored. His expression darkened immediately the second he noticed Clara walking beside Ethan. You delayed a board meeting for this? Daniel asked coldly. Ethan removed his coat calmly. Good afternoon to you too. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances while Clara remained near the doorway, wishing the floor would open beneath her feet. Victoria quietly took her seat beside the legal team without explanation. Ethan placed his tablet onto the table. We have discrepancies in the Southeast Asia projections. Daniel crossed his arms. We already reviewed those numbers. Ethan's gray eyes lifted slowly toward him. Did you? Silence tightened across the room. Daniel forced a thin smile. And your source is apparently a diner waitress? Clara felt heat crawl into her face immediately. A few people shifted awkwardly in their chairs. Ethan remained completely still. Her name is Clara Bennett. Daniel gave a dismissive laugh under his breath. Of course it is. Clara should have stayed quiet. Every instinct screamed at her to stay invisible. But then she noticed the charts on the nearest screen again. The same manipulated freight numbers. The same artificial smoothing curves. And suddenly fear became smaller than frustration. Your Singapore shipping ratios are mathematically impossible, Clara said softly. The room went silent. Daniel turned toward her slowly. Excuse me. Clara stepped closer to the screen despite her shaking hands. Your projected margins increase while regional freight costs rise and import volume decreases. She pointed carefully toward one section. Real growth would create uneven volatility here. This line is too controlled. Daniel laughed sharply. You expect us to believe you understand international logistics? Clara swallowed once before answering quietly. No, I expect you to understand them. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, hiding the smallest trace of a smile. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances now, while Clara continued speaking despite her fear. Someone adjusted outcome patterns manually instead of organically. She looked directly at Daniel then. Because whoever changed these numbers focused on presentation instead of market behavior. Daniel's face hardened. This is absurd. Is it? Victoria spoke for the first time all afternoon. Calm. Precise. I verified her analysis before we arrived. Another silence. Heavier this time. One executive near the far side of the table adjusted his glasses nervously. Another reopened financial files on his laptop immediately. Clara's heartbeat thundered inside her chest now, but something strange was happening. The more she spoke, the less invisible she felt. Ethan watched her carefully from across the room. Not rescuing her. Not interrupting. Just listening. The way nobody had listened in years. Daniel's confidence finally cracked around the edges. Barely visible. But Ethan noticed it instantly. Run the raw freight audits, Ethan ordered calmly. Every quarter from the last 18 months. Ethan, Daniel began sharply. Now. The single word froze the room. Nobody argued after that. Clara stepped back slowly, suddenly aware of her own breathing again. One of the older executives looked toward her in disbelief. Where exactly did you study economics? Clara hesitated before answering honestly. Mostly public libraries. Another long silence followed. But this one felt different somehow. Not dismissive. Respectful. Ethan finally stood and walked slowly toward the conference room windows overlooking Manhattan. Rain drifted softly across the skyline far below while reflections shimmered across the glass beside him. Funny thing about intelligence, he said quietly without turning around. The world only notices it after someone wealthy points at it first. Nobody spoke. Ethan finally looked back toward Clara then. Calm gray eyes. Honest. But it was there the entire time. Clara stood frozen beneath the glow of city lights and computer screens, her worn notebook still clutched tightly against her chest. And for the first time in years, nobody in the room was looking at her like she was just a waitress anymore.